Hi, I'm Pete, and welcome to Just a Few Acres Farm. I got my parts for the rear end of the Farmall MD, and oh, they're beautiful. Let me show you. We got all kinds of gaskets here. Sometimes I make my own gaskets, but this time I thought I'd treat myself. O-rings for the both pinion shafts, lots of seals here, and then my favorite part. Bearings. Loads and loads of new bearings in here. Look at them all. Good quality too. Almost all these bearings are SKF replacements. Beautiful. And I have a nice clean transmission case, cleaned up gear sets, and a free day today. It's about 5 below outside, so don't feel guilty about spending the day in the shop. We're going to start putting her back together. The very first thing I need to do is replace the bushings in this reverse idler gear shaft. And I'm going to tap out the old bushings using this socket, which fits nice in the bore. If I had to guess, I'd say one of these had spun inside the bore. That one's tight, the other one's not. There's one, there's two. I have 2 new bushings here, and these may need to be honed to fit correctly. In fact, I'm guessing that they're going to need it because they don't even fit on the shaft without being pressed into the bore. So, first thing we'll do is fit them into the bore and put a little oil inside the bore. These bushings have a hole in them, but orientation of the hole isn't important because there's no oil supply holes inside. This, as I said in the last video, oils from the inside out via a hole in the shaft that goes in the center. And lo and behold, I have a bushing driver that fits this bushing, so I'll use that to put it in. Flip it over and install the other bushing. Now, without a doubt, this needs honing. It won't fit. I'm going to use a snap gauge to measure the inside diameter of the bushing. Use a micrometer to measure my snap gauge, what I read off of the bushing ID. And I've got 1.222. And then I can measure the shaft. We'll start at 1.2, 1.233. So right now the ID of the bushings is about 11 thousandths less than the OD of the shaft, and the running clearance for this is 3 thousandths to 5 thousandths. So I've got some honing to do to fit the bushings to the shaft. These bushings were noted as possibly needing honing to fit, and it's not uncommon, I guess. I found it's much easier to do this on the drill press. I'm working on the second one, and this made me realize I really need to buy a good set of hones, not these little brake cylinder hones that I've got. This is taking forever. Bushings are done. I got a nice fit on the shaft. 3 thousandths clearance on both bushings. Nice and smooth. Rotation. Job 1 done. I'm using a combination of just motor oil and engine assembly lube, depending on the part. Set the gear in like this. Run the shaft through from the back side. I don't know what I was thinking on the disassembly video. You can slide this shaft out from the back and the front. There we go. 1 bolt. Hold the shaft in. Next, we can put in the lower shaft or counter shaft because it rotates counter to the main shaft. Then take off this bearing retainer that I just put here temporarily. Here's that retainer, here's the bearing. It's got a big snap ring on the outside of it, and it actually sits like this, and then this part goes in the bore in the transmission. The gasket goes on like this. There's an oil hole at the bottom that you got to keep track of and line up the gasket. I lubed this bearing. I got a bit of a special condition to take care of on this shaft, so I'm going to put the bearings on first. Slide the new back bearing on. Tap that into the bore. We can put the snap ring back on. Now that I got the counter shaft and both bearings in, I put the retainer back on, and here's the special condition I want to take care of. This nut on the end of the counter shaft, you can see where seals have ridden on it in the past, and there's a nice clean area where I want my new seal to ride. I want it to ride right on that. So I got to put the nut on here, figure out where it is in relationship to this bearing retainer, because I've got all kinds of room to move these seals forward and back on this retainer to hit that unworn area. Actually, looking at this more, when this sets in here, the face of the bearing here is equal to this face right here. So as long as I set this on a table with this, taking into account this recess, set this nut on here, I can get the seal in the right location to ride on the unworn surface. Now I could use a speedy sleeve on this too. I could put a speedy sleeve on. But since I've got a good surface to run on, I don't need a speedy sleeve. I just need to put the seal in the right plane. So I'll go ahead and put the seal in, and then we can gauge where we're at by sliding in the counter shaft nut. And yes, I'm weird, but I like to coat these with high tack. I had a problem early on with some of them leaking around the outside, even though they've got this paint that's supposed to make the seal. So I don't know, it's cheap insurance. And I drive these with a 3/4 inch socket that's about the same size as the seal. I got it in there about halfway down. Put a little grease on this and see where it sits. I'll just set the old bearing in there to get everything lined up in the proper plane. There we go. And I wanted the lip of that seal sitting right on the bright area. Hopefully you can see that. It is. It's the lower lip that we're concerned about. And then if you look from the top, you can see the bright edge protruding from the outside of the seal. So it's where we want it to be. So now with that figured out, we can go ahead and put the gasket on and assemble it on the tractor. Top. That makes it easy. Most things only go together one way. There aren't very many torque specs for these old tractors. I used to use a chart that was torque based on the size of the bolt, and then after I got a feel for it, I quit using it. How tight? Tight enough. Tight enough. Now I can thread the counter shaft nut on that drives the hydraulic pump. Tighten up. Nice. Next we can install the top shaft in the transmission, and this one's got the sliding gears on it, so I gotta take them off to put a new bearing on. And the bearing's got to go into this cage. Big honker. There we go. Close up all right. Take this, put it on here. And we got a snap ring to go on. And then this retainer back here. And then the gears. Take this retainer off that I put on here temporarily. Oh man, might need to bump that off. There we go. This one is super simple to put in because it only has to go through the rear hole. Huh, I forgot the shims. Can't forget the shims. All right. It's kind of heavy. Slide all these forward. Come on, mesh. There we go. So I can get at the bolts and the shims. Get everything lined up here. Well, I'll be a monkey's uncle. You know, I forgot something. It's not that big a deal when you forget something. It's when you forget it long enough that you've gone past the point of no return and lots of work. This one's easy. It's the thing that's rattling around in here. That's what made me think of that. This other retainer plate goes on here. Hey, I forgot to grease that bearing too. It's not the end of the world if you don't grease them. I just like to do it for a little extra insurance. I can grease it after I get it in there. Now, of course, this is still unsupported at the front until I put the input shaft on, which we'll do next. And I forgot one other thing, which is the inner race of this pilot bearing that goes on the end of this. Should have put it on here before I put it in. Hopefully it'll just tap right on there. Of course, I should have done this before I put the bearing on it to not stress the bearing, but it'll be all right. The rear bearing, that is. And then this nut goes on to retain it here. There. I forgot to lube up this bearing in here, so we'll get that. Why did the knight with no arms and no legs surrender? I mean, aside from obvious reasons, no arms, no legs. Well, because he was unarmed and defeated. Unarmed, defeated. I don't think I really got to explain that one, do I? Everybody knows how bad they are. They don't require an explanation. They just require a groan. This is the input shaft that goes in the front of the transmission, hooks up to that shaft that I just put in. This is the end that mates with the end of that shaft, and I put the inner race of that pilot bearing at the end of the other shaft. The outer race and the rest of the bearing, if the bearing had survived, would be in here. There's a little snap ring here I need to take out, and then I need to take the outer race out and put in this new roller bearing that goes right in here, the inner race of which is already on the other shaft. And conveniently, to get this out, because it's in a blind hole here, IH put two holes that goes through this so you can put a punch in and drive the race out from the other side. First, I got to take this snap ring out. Well, I love snap rings. You got a hand hole in you? You don't have a hand hole in you. Finger hole. Finger hole? Oh, now you're out. Snap ring. Race. Meet punch. You're coming, slowly, nudge by nudge. Let's try this. There. Gotta get creative sometimes. Oh yeah, before I put this in, I wanted to mention something. Fifth gear going out on these is quite common, and what happens is you put it into fifth and you gotta hold it in fifth on the gear shift or it pops out of gear on you. What happens is these teeth on the very end of this gear get worn. These are somewhat worn, but they'll wear right down to that unworn portion, and then you can't keep it in gear. The same's true on the other end where the gear mates up. See that gear mates right up in there, and that's direct drive. That's fifth gear, this outer spline here. So they both wear so much, mainly from grinding the gears when you're putting it into fifth, you know, going from fourth into road gear with the tractor rolling, that these need to be replaced, and these are readily available aftermarket. So now that we got that old pilot bearing out, we can put the new one in. Oil that up a little bit. These little buggers are expensive for what you get. Glad I could still get them though. Million and one uses for sockets. And the snap ring goes back in. There we go. Oh, I left a piece of my glove in there. Get out of there. We don't want you in there for the next generation to find. Loop this bearing up. Now we can assemble this shaft. So we've got a bearing, big honker that goes on here. That's the rear bearing. Now with that bearing seated, we can put the housing on like that. And the front bearing slides right over there. And we can put the gasket on here, coat the other side. I think the word of the day is forgot. As in, I forgot to put the bearing spacer in before I put this bearing in. You get going and sometimes you forget important things. What I forgot is in between the two bearings sits the spacer to hold them the correct distance apart. I'm glad I remembered that sooner or later and not too much later. Now we're ready to put it in. Now we got an oil supply hole here that we line up on this, and we also have to line up the pilot bearing here inside. Remember, I greased the other side of that bearing. Need to get everything lined up. One other thing I forgot is that these bolts don't go into blind holes in the casting. They're through holes that go into the transmission. So I use this gasket sealer also as a thread sealer, and it works really well that way. This is Permatex High Tack, in case you're wondering. I know it's old school, but it's worked for me on so many tractors. I'm like, well, there's no reason to change if it works. All right, now we can tighten them up. Maybe. And that's it for the transmission gear shafts. We can just check them here and see how they turn. That's in neutral. Put it in, say, fifth gear. That ringing you hear is backlash between the gear teeth. That's the way these transmissions are. They have backlash. Run through all the gears. Here's reverse. Feels nice and smooth. Now all I got to do is put the seal on the front of the input shaft. This is the seal retainer, and here's a new seal for that shaft, and this is the shaft that seats in the seal. It's in good shape, so I'm not worried about the seal position like I was with the counter shaft. Set that in. Whoops. SKF bearings, SKF seals. And a gasket. The next step would normally be to install this input shaft coupling on here, but I don't know if you remember, but I had a Woodruff key that's been worked on. It's got some wear in it, so I forgot to get a new Woodruff key, and it's a funky one. It's a long, shallow one. I've got some shorter ones that are this size, but I want to get the longer one, and then I'll put this on, but not today. She looks beautiful. I'm happy with it. It's good to get this back together. The next job to do is assemble the rear end, the differential, the bolt pinions, bolt gears, axles. That's a job for another day. There's all these parts to clean up before putting back in. The sun's starting to go down already. That's it for the transmission. They're pretty easy peasy. There's not a lot of parts to them. And if you happen to look at the parts book, unlike I did while you're doing it, you'll have less of these I forgot that and I forgot this. And it'll go a lot smoother for you. But all in all, it's pretty simple. And the final drive and rear end will be pretty simple too. I hope you enjoyed this video and I hope you have a great day. And I'll see you next time.